In this video, I'm going to offer a critique of the popular Christian apologist Frank Turek with the allegation that he strawmans atheism. So let's take a look. Begin with the golden rule. Of course, this is a well-known rule, easy to articulate, hard to live by. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, the way that this famous teaching from Jesus can be applied to the rough and tumble of apologetic discourse and interaction is to interact with the ideas of others with the same charity and generosity that you would like them to interact with your ideas. Once again, not hard to understand, but perhaps sometimes hard to live out. And I think Frank Turek has a particularly hard time following the golden rule, as I'm going to argue. Frankly, when an apologist fundamentally fails to exhibit basic charity and generosity toward their interlocutor, they are hurting their cause, and thus, frankly, being an embarrassment to the cause of Christian apologetics. So this is important. And the book I'm going to focus on is Frank Turek's 2015 book, Stealing from God: Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case, with a wonderful foreword and endorsement from Ravi Zacharias, who says the pages ahead will inform and inspire. Of course, it's kind of tough when you're the person who wrote your foreword later is shown to be a sexual predator. But moving on, here is a page from Amazon describing Stealing from God. You can see that it has over 800 5-star reviews on average. And the description says, if you think atheists have reason, evidence, and science on their side, think again. Award-winning author Dr. Frank Turek will show you how atheists steal reason, evidence, science, and other arguments from God in trying to make their case for atheism. If that sounds contradictory, it's because it is. Atheists can't make their case without appealing to realities only theism can explain. In an engaging and memorable way, Stealing from God exposes these intellectual crimes atheists are committing, and then provides 4 powerful reasons for why Christianity is true. Here is how Lee Strobel describes or endorses the book Stealing from God. He says, as a journal at the Chicago Tribune, I covered some horrific crimes that helped cement me in my atheism. I didn't realize that I was committing a series of intellectual crimes by stealing from God in order to argue against him. Frank Turek brilliantly exposes these crimes, C-R-I-M-E-S, an acronym, of atheism in a way that you'll never forget. So note that Strobel here is comparing the atheist who seeks to defend their atheism by way of argument and explanation. He compares them to a criminal who commits a horrific crime. In the same way that that murderer kills somebody and commits a terrible crime, so the atheist is committing terrible crimes against God. Crimes. What is this acronym actually standing for? Well, we find in the table of contents. C-R-I-M-E-S, the C, chapter 1, is for causality. God is the one origin of the universe. 2 is reason, that Christianity and theism is the best explanation, or the only explanation, for an immaterial mind. Chapter 3 is information, so the idea that the biological information of the cell, intelligent design arguments in essence, is explained only through God. Chapter 4 is morality, that you can only have God through or objective moral value through God. Chapter 5 is evil, that God, in fact, evil is not a problem for God, but is only best explained with the existence of God. And chapter 6 on science, that science can only find its basis in a theistic worldview. I want to look at 2 of these arguments, in particular chapter 2 on reason, or the immateriality of the mind, and chapter 4 on morality, or the idea that objective moral value can only be rooted in God. So let's briefly look first of all at chapter 2, talking about the mind and materialism. So here, what Turek argues is that atheism is committed to a materialist understanding of the universe and thus of the mind, that everything that exists is material in nature, and thus the mind is material in nature. And this is what Turek says. The bottom line is that atheism cannot be shown to be true in principle. It has destroyed all the tools necessary to do the job. The tools in this case being immaterial thoughts. In order to construct any valid argument for atheism, the atheist has to steal tools from God's universe, because no such tools exist in the world of atheism. Theism has these tools, but atheists have ruled out that possibility in advance through their ideology of materialism. Well, there's a lot that one could say here, but I am simply going to make a couple points here. The first point is that it is, in fact, absolutely false to claim that atheism somehow is essentially linked to materialism. As a case in point, here is an example of a very well-known philosopher of mind who is also an atheist and is also one of the strongest critics of materialist theories of mind. His name is Colin McGinn. This is one of his books on the topic, his popular 2000 book, The Mysterious Flame, written for a popular audience, where he critiques materialist accounts of mind. And yet McGinn is an outspoken atheist. Just as you can have atheists who critique materialism, including materialist theories of mind, so you can have Christians and theists who defend materialist theories of mind. One of the best known is Peter Van Inwagen, a well-known Christian philosopher and a defender of a materialist account of mind. So this attempt by Turek to link materialism of the mind essentially to atheism and then argue that you can't argue as a result, it's just false. Well, the second chapter we want to look at is chapter 4, talking about objective moral value. Now I want to skip ahead beyond that chapter to near the end of the book, page 185, where Turek quotes and summarizes, I should say, the argument, the gist of the argument in chapter 4. It goes like this: if objective moral values exist, then God exists. It is certainly more obvious that torturing babies for fun is objectively wrong, and that love is objectively right, than any argument one could offer for atheism. So note what Turek is doing here. He's first of all arguing that atheism entails, again, is essentially committed to non-objective accounts of moral value. In other words, you could have an anti-realist account of moral value or a subjective account of moral value. In other words, you could say there is no such thing, or it's only relative to the individual or to the society. But what you can't have on atheism, according to Turek, is an objective account of moral value. And that would entail that torturing babies for fun is not objectively wrong, and thus atheism entails that torturing babies for fun is not objectively wrong. But clearly, torturing babies for fun is objectively wrong, and thus atheism is false. That's the argument, really. The problem with that argument is that it, once again, as with materialism, atheism is not committed to the denial of objective moral value. In fact, there are well-known atheists, very well-known philosophers who defend objective moral value. An example is Eric Wielenberg in his 2005 book, Value and Virtue in a Godless Universe, an atheist who defends objective moral value. Another very practical example of this is the debate some years ago between William Lane Craig and Shelley Kagan. Kagan is a well-known atheist philosopher and ethicist, and they were debating the existence of objective moral value. The thing to note in the debate is that Kagan accepts objective moral value and he's an atheist. And if you watch that debate, I will say this: most people, myself included, believe that Kagan soundly won that debate, which frankly is unusual for Craig debates. Usually William Lane Craig comes out on top, but not in that debate, which just underscores the point that atheism is not in any way essentially connected to the denial of objective moral value. So once again, the core argument that Turek is presenting us here with is absolutely tendentious. It's just false. Just to underscore that point, I just want to briefly note a couple other books. Ronald Dworkin's book, Religion Without God, and J.L. Schellenberg's book, Progressive Atheism, both cover similar territory. And what they're both arguing, among other things, is that atheism is consistent with a very metaphysically, ethically robust account of reality. The only thing that atheism is committed to denying is the existence of God. It's not committed to denying the existence of objective meaning or objective value or objective purpose. In principle, you could accept all of those claims and yet deny the existence of God. And if you don't believe me, take the time to read Dworkin and Schellenberg's books and then draw your own decision, your own conclusion. So this leads me to my conclusion that I believe what Turek does throughout his book is strawmanning. He strawmans atheists. Now, what strawmanning is the intentional misrepresentation of a position in its weaker form because it is easier to critique or defeat or reject the position in that weak form rather than in its more robust or correct form. And so when Turek says atheism entails materialism about the mind, atheism entails the rejection of objective moral value, well, then Turek can knock down atheism because he knocks down the position of materialism about mind or non-objectivism about moral value. But that is strawmanning because atheism is not essentially connected to either position. The other thing that really troubles me about this book, Stealing from God, is that it is based on an inflammatory extended metaphor. Now, a metaphor is a figure of speech, a way of talking idiomatically in language, rather than literally, of seeing one thing in terms of another thing. If I say I am a rock, I am not literally saying I am a chunk of igneous rock. What I'm saying is I am like a rock in that I am separated from my environment, unaffected by the world around me. I am a rock. And what Turek seems to be doing here is invoking metaphorical language throughout the book. So if we're going to be clear on what the metaphor is, let's first be clear on what the literal issue is, the literal language. Literally, what we have, according to Turek's argument, is atheists are appealing to concepts when they lack the metaphysical justification to appeal to that concept. So, for example, he believes they're appealing to thoughts in order to make their argument, and yet they lack a mind because all they have is a material brain, according to his view. They have a moral sense, and so they appeal to moral values, but in fact, they have no basis for objective moral value. So that's the claim. What is literally happening is atheists are appealing to concepts for which they don't have justification. But here's where he lays over an interpretation, excuse me, of this in terms of metaphor. In this case, it is an extended metaphor of stealing, of criminal activity, of committing crimes. So that on this metaphor, when a person appeals to a concept when they lack the metaphysical justification to appeal to that concept, you then say they are stealing the concept and they are a criminal committing a terrible crime. And that is the way that Turek then chooses to frame the way that atheists are allegedly appealing to thoughts and objective moral value when they have no justification to do so. Now, this is a deeply uncharitable way to describe what atheists are doing, even if you believed an atheist was committed to materialism and was appealing to thoughts when they were not justified in doing so. It's still very uncharitable to say that they're committing a crime and stealing. This is, I think, can be accurately described as poisoning the well. Poisoning the well would be the presentation of negative information, in this case, I believe false negative information about an opponent, as a way of preempting the force of their argument, undercutting the force of their argument, while they're stealing from God, so we don't need to listen to them. I think what Turek is also doing here is an ad hominem. He's attacking people as individuals, accusing them of being criminals rather than engaging critically with their arguments. I think what is going on here is frankly driven by anti-atheistic prejudice. This long-standing prejudice, this long-standing prejudicial belief, presupposition, that atheism is driven by the sinful rebellion against God and suppression of the knowledge of God. And it ultimately then collapses into othering rhetoric. You treat atheists as outsiders, people that you cannot trust. I critique all of these approaches toward atheism in my 2015 book, Is the Atheist My Neighbor? Rethinking Christian Attitudes Toward Atheism. In that book, I provide, I believe, abundant evidence that Christians have exhibited historical prejudice against atheists. And for the sake of Christian hospitality and discipleship, we really need to stop doing that. So what if atheists treated Christians like Turek treats atheists? This is what I want to conclude with. What if atheists painted Christianity the way that Turek paints atheism? Well, then they could argue that just as Turek says atheism entails materialism, so they could say, well, Christianity entails young earth creationism. And so if the atheist is somehow committed to the views of people like Richard Dawkins or something, he could say, well, Christians, you're committed to the views of Ken Ham. And if you then say, no, I am not committed to young earth creationism. I, in fact, accept neo-Darwinian evolution or I accept the age of the earth and uniformitarian geology. Well, then what Turek could say is, okay, you're actually stealing from science as you do that. Now, I think Christians would be deeply resentful of this. If atheists attempted to say that all Christianity really is only consistent if it's young earth creationism, and that Christians then, when they go beyond that, they're stealing from science, you would have little patience with that. It's totally uncharitable. It's not the golden rule. I think it's quite clear that the exact same is true of Turek. When he tries to claim that atheism entails materialism about the mind, a rejection of objective moral value, that's strawmanning. When he attempts then to frame atheists as criminals who are stealing against God, he's just engaged in a deeply uncharitable rhetorical gambit to otherize and marginalize atheists in a way that I believe poisons the well and is a fundamental failure of Christian discipleship, and thus is not a good case of loving one's neighbor, as I believe every Christian apologist should.